I'm Adam Weinstein, and I work as a research fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, which is a think tank that favors the U.S. foreign policy rooted in military restraint and diplomacy to advance U.S. interests and more peaceful relations with the world. The U.S. Pakistan security relationship is one of the most important for both countries, but also one that is fraught with distrust, tensions, and disagreements. The last decade brought a reduction in urban terrorism inside Pakistan, and Islamabad was a crucial partner in bringing about the latest US Taliban talks and intra-Afghan negotiations. Nevertheless, the relationship is often defined by Washington's perception that Pakistan is double dealing and Islamabad's rejection of what it views as permanent demands by the US to do more. Terrorist groups still operate in Pakistan's tribal areas, and its large cities still fall prey to sectarian violence. What then is the future of US-Pakistan counterterrorism cooperation beyond Afghanistan? To help us answer these questions, we are joined by an excellent panel, which includes Shamila Chowdhury, who served in President Obama's White House as Director for Pakistan and Afghanistan on the National Security Council from 2010 to 2011. She's also currently the president of the American Pakistan Foundation. We also are joined by Dr. Asfanjar Mir, who is a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for International Security and Cooperation at Stanford University. And last but not least, we are joined by Dr. Zoha Wasim, who is a postdoctoral research fellow at the Institute for Global City Policing at University College London, also co-coordinator for the Urban Violence Research Network. For those of you watching through Zoom, you can use the Q&A function to ask questions, which will probably take in the last 20 minutes of the panel. And for those watching on Facebook, you can use the comments section. So we're going to forgo opening statements and get right into it. This first question is directed to Shamila. Shamila, in written testimony to the House Foreign Affairs Committee, you stated that the Trump administration has reduced engagement with Pakistan to a singular thread, ending the war in Afghanistan. And you assert that it locked the United States out of productive channels of engagement with Pakistan. Can you expand on this and give us an overview of what U.S.-Pakistan relations look like from a security perspective right now?
So first, let me just thank Adam and the Quincy Institute for inviting me. It's great to be on this panel. Adam, I love that you read my testimony. That makes me feel so happy. I don't think anyone was even listening to it, but I'm glad that you read it. So I think that, you ask a really good question. It's somewhat of an age-old question of, where is this relationship headed in terms of the security cooperation? And in general, I would just define it as it's complicated relationship that's consistent with historical trends. And I don't anticipate it to change, right? And what that means is that the security interests on the US and the Pakistan side remain the same. I would argue that the US is interested in Afghanistan and that border region, and that's not really going to change. And what the US is interested in is then defines who the US engages, which is the military, right? So it becomes this mill, and then on our side, the civilians are engaged. And then on the Pakistan side, it's also what the interests of the military are. That defines what the relationship with Pakistan is. So it's not like it's just one-sided. It's two-sided for sure, but it just limits, right? It has limited the number of stakeholders that are involved. And I think right now, what we're seeing is like a very heavily centralized, high-level engagement between presidents and prime ministers and military leaders, essentially. And it's cut out all of these other stakeholders that really do have, they do have a say, obviously, but they're actually becoming much more intimately involved in the conflict and the violence. So, and we'll get into this, like the police, law enforcement, the courts, sectarian groups, and then local governments, right? And because there's just a very local flavor to a lot of the conflict. And we meaning the governments at the bilateral level have only been looking at it from like this top line, regional geopolitical angle. And by the way, I don't think that's going to change because by design, the US has fairly limited interests when it comes to Pakistan's internal stability. And it has always been, since 9/11, it's been our interest has been defined by the question of, is there an internal threat in Pakistan that will target Americans or American interests? And as that dwindles, the focus is going to shift obviously more towards Afghanistan and stability there and what role Pakistan can play. And I think that's really where we need to focus on. And I'm going to end with this point, which is, the US is going to be interested in three things, or there are three things for us to pay attention to. One is the US wants to bring troops home. No, that's not going to change with a new president, new administration. The second is that the US wants to maintain and sustain Pakistan's help with the peace process in Afghanistan, whatever that means, right? And that's always been the sliding variable. It's a sliding variable that dictates like how much the US pressures Pakistan on the anti-India groups. If the Pakistanis are helping us more with the Afghan Taliban, then the US might not pressure so much. They might talk about it more privately. If they're not helping, you're going to see the public pressure ramp up. And then finally, to the extent that the United States wants to engage India, with India, it has so many other interests beyond security that, to the extent that relationship evolves and grows, that there will be kind of opportunities or moments where the US will consider pushing Pakistan more on groups like LET and JUD. And that's where you get more into the provincial politics and stakeholders, and which will be really hard for us to do because we don't engage with those communities and stakeholders as much as we should. So I'm going to stop there.
Just a quick follow-up, because you ended by saying we don't engage with those stakeholders as much as we should. And you also mentioned that US interests in Pakistan aren't really related to the domestic politics of the country. Is this by design, or is this the way it should be? And do you think there's anything to learn from China's relationship with Pakistan, or even some of our European partners' relations with Pakistan?
So I think, let me clarify relationships and engagement. I think we have an embassy and consulates, and for decades, the foreign service officers and officials that have been posted there have been building those relationships. They actually have good relationships, meaning they talk to them, they report. Obviously, they haven't gotten out as much as they could since 9/11, but though at that level of bureaucratic engagement, there's a consistency. What has changed is because the level of funding has gone down so low, there's just no reason for the United States to engage various institutions. So for example, a lot of the devolution of power from the federal to the provincial means that the provincial governments are being responsible for certain things like education, security, that sort of thing. Hi, my little kid is here. He's talking to me. Okay, go find your dad, okay? All right, so by the way, this has never happened. This is the first time this happened to me. I'm gonna put myself on mute, and you guys can talk. I'll come back.
We can transition to someone else. So for the moment, I guess this is the reality we all live in with Zoom meetings these days. So let me transition to Asfandyar. Can you give us a breakdown of what the terrorism landscape looks like inside Pakistan right now, and how that might affect some of the interests that the US has both in Pakistan and Afghanistan? But just give us an overview of what the terror landscape inside the country looks like and has looked like during the Trump administration.
Sure. Thanks so much for having me on the panel, Adam, and thank you to Quincy for hosting this conversation. It's a very important conversation. It's a difficult one as well. And so, before I get to your specific question, I want to build off things that Shamila just said. I think it's important to recognize that the U.S. Pakistan counterterrorism relationship remains in stress. I think some might argue that the level of stress has receded in the last few years. In fact, close watchers might remember that the bilateral relationship between the US and Pakistan almost collapsed in 2017. At one point, the two countries even stopped sharing intelligence related to terrorism. So while there's been recovery from that low point, I think there's still ample friction and a lot more conflict than cooperation. From both sides. I think from the US perspective, the relationship is amongst the most complicated and consequential CT partnerships of the post 9/11 period. And I think we've long been stuck in three strategic verticals. Again, from an American perspective, The first has been the killing and capturing of Al-Qaeda, Islamic State, and some of their allied actors in the Afghanistan-Pakistan region, and specifically those that have remained in the Pakistani tribal belt. The second vertical has been the kill and capture of Afghan Taliban leadership, and that's an ask that the U.S. government has now revisited over the last 2 years. The U.S. does not demand that of the Pakistanis. But the US continues to demand degradation of the infrastructure of the Afghan insurgency inside Pakistan, and that remains a sticking point and weighs on the relationship. And the third vertical is the arrest, prosecution, and targeting of Pakistani jihadists focused towards India, which want to fight in Kashmir or want to engage in violence in other parts of India. And again, this remains a sticking point. I sense that the Trump admin, or at least some officials, are patting themselves on the back for some nominal progress, but overall there is distrust and not a lot of confidence that there's been movement here. Now switching frames from US to Pakistani priorities, I think indications are that Pakistan has pushed 3 counterterrorism goals, especially under the Trump admin. One, they have asked the US to target Afghanistan-based extremist leaders attacking Pakistan, such as the leader of the Pakistan Taliban. And there have been some major hits over the last 2 years. The big one was, of course, Maulvi Fazlullah, the chief of the Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan, in June 2018. And before him, his deputy is the second in command of the Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan, Khalid Sajna, was killed along the Afghanistan-Pakistan border. Pakistan has also pushed the US and continues to ask for sanctions against Baloch separatists based in Afghanistan as well as parts of Europe. In 2019, I think there was some movement on that. The US government sanctioned the Baloch Liberation Army, which fulfilled a key Pakistani ask. And finally, Pakistan seeks US to recognize, in effect, use of Afghan territory as a problem for Pakistan. Pakistani objective seems to be less to reduce the material threat of Indian presence and more to sort of shame India. But even here, I think from a Pakistani perspective, there's been movement. Special Envoy for Peace for Afghanistan, Zalmay Khalilzad, has been talking about an addendum political agreement between various Afghan factions and Pakistan on not letting each other's territory to be used against the other, which in my read is an implicit attempt to sort of mitigate Pakistan's concern on India and Afghanistan. So that's the state of the overall relationship. I think the threat remains. In the tribal areas, the Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan is once again on the march. It has become politically more cohesive. It is marshaling more organizational capital. It has lots of fighters, according to the UN, north of 6,000 fighters across Pakistani tribal belt. The TTP remains aligned with Al-Qaeda. And I'm sure Shumaila remembers that the TTP was the paramilitary of Al-Qaeda's sort of global network in the Afghanistan-Pakistan region. So that threat remains resilient, which should be of concern to US policymakers.
So Asfandiyar, you mentioned Pakistan's concerns about India possibly conducting some sort of proxy conflict against Pakistan. And even former United States Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel said in 2013, he said, and I quote, "India for some time has always used Afghanistan as a second front, and India has over the years financed problems for Pakistan and on that side of the border." But also we see tensions in the tribal areas, civil rights abuses that have spurred the Pakistan Tahaffuz movement, the Pashtun Tahaffuz movement, excuse me. And we see a rise of TTP again. So to what extent is the rise of the Pakistani Taliban a response to errors on the part of the Pakistani state? And to what extent is insecurity in Baluchistan and the tribal areas due to broader tensions with India?
So my read is that the TTP's revival and the continuation of militancy in the Pakistani tribal belt is owed more to local factors as well as the politics internal to the TTP. And finally, its alliance with Al-Qaeda and the Afghan Taliban. The TTP is emboldened by the Afghan Taliban's sort of victory. The fact that the U.S. has struck a deal with the Taliban that serves as a model for them. They want to emulate the Afghan Taliban in many ways. They've long sort of seen them as an inspiration. And in addition, I think there are fingerprints of Indian involvement. With the number of different armed groups which operate in Pakistan. But ultimately, the influence of a group and movement like Al-Qaeda is much more powerful. Al-Qaeda continues to appeal to the TTP leadership to politically unify. This has been a long-standing demand of Al-Qaeda. And so I see the recent reunification more in line with Al-Qaeda's ideology and doctrine, as opposed to some other external force. And then, as you mentioned, I think Pakistani counterinsurgency was effective for a period of time. It certainly degraded the capabilities of a lot of these groups, but Pakistani counterinsurgency violence did not try to sort of settle the root causes of the militancy. There's been enormous civilian suffering and harm due to which the population is really alienated, and I think the Pashtun Tahafuz movement is a manifestation of Pakistani counterinsurgency methods.
Zoha, so both of our guests have talked about arrests, and I believe Shamaila alluded to the 18th Amendment, which gave more power to the provinces than to the federal government. And we're talking about also civil rights in Pakistan's own war on terrorism, so to speak, and some of the events that incited the Pashtun Tahafuz movement occurred at the hands of Pakistani police against Pashtuns. So I was wondering if you could give us an overview of what the counterterrorism fight looks like in Pakistan's urban centers, such as Karachi, where a lot of the fighting has been led by both the police and the Sindh Rangers, and basically a broad coalition of groups that I think few folks outside of Pakistan and even many folks inside Pakistan don't really understand. So if you could enlighten us, that would be great.
Sure. Thank you, Adam, for having me here, and thank you to Quincy as well. So I think some really interesting points were raised by both Shamaila and Asfalia, and I'll come back to Shamaila's point about sort of limited interest in engaging with local institutions, because I think U.S. engagement with sort of policing, provincial policing, but also sort of urban policing. It's an interesting relationship, and I think it's developing in terms of U.S. trying to play a role in reforming the police in Pakistan, and I think that can be discussed a little more later, perhaps. In terms of the urban sort of policing landscape or urban counterterrorism landscape in Pakistan, I can focus primarily on Karachi, as that's been my main sort of case study. So yes, like you said, it's a fairly complex sort of a landscape. Multiple actors are involved, both civilian and military. So as some of our viewers might know already, we've got the main actor, obviously, in terms of the civilian side is the civilian police, which is the Karachi police that comes under the Sindh police, and technically reports to the and is answerable to the Sindh government. And there's obviously a lot of politics around that, because there are attempts to kind of do away with that provincial control over the police, and we can sort of discuss that later if necessary as well. But the other main player that has been becoming an increasingly a key stakeholder in Pakistan's political landscape is, of course, a paramilitary force, which is called the Sindh Rangers. They've been there since pretty much around 1989, so it's been about 30 years since they've been present in Karachi, and they were called in to assist the civilian police initially, because and to help the police essentially to maintain law and order. But over the years, they have acquired significant powers. They have expanded locally. Sort of to give you a sort of a local perspective or how it actually looks on the ground. is that over the years, and this is also before the Karachi operation that started in 2013. So since the early 2000s, they have been empowered to establish their own pickets. They have been empowered to carry out stop and search, and they've been given more and more policing powers over the years. And then once Karachi operation started, it's sort of understood that it was going to be led by the Sindh Rangers. And I think that has been, a little bit problematic in terms of the relationship between the Sindh police and the Sindh Rangers, because the Sindh police sort of tends to feel that they're playing second fiddle to the Sindh Rangers, and that compromises the legitimacy of the civilian police, of course, as well. And over the last, I would say, 4 or 5 years, the Sindh Rangers have been empowered to carry out investigations. They have their own centers where they can, physical spaces where they can detain suspects. And under amendments to the Anti-Terrorism Act, they have also been empowered to detain suspects for 90 days without charge, which is something the civilian police department, called the counterterrorism department, is also empowered with. But then you can see that there are overlapping mandates, right? Because you're dealing with you're dealing with similar threats, you're dealing with similar groups, and you have these overlapping mandates and similar roles and responsibilities. So I can build on that a little bit more if needed, but that's pretty much what we're seeing in Karachi at the moment. You've got two big players, the Sindh police that is answerable to the Sindh government, and you've got the Sindh Rangers answerable for all intents and purposes to the Pakistan Army. I should have clarified that earlier. It's understood to be like a hybrid sort of an entity, which reports both to the army and to the Ministry of Interior. But I think it's a well-established or a well-known fact that it takes orders directly from the Pakistan Army, and the officers are also seconded from the Pakistan Army. So there are military officers, there are no civilian police officers in the Sindh Rangers. So it's very much what some people say on the ground, the political arm of the Pakistan Army in Sindh. So I can expand upon that if needed.
Well, so when I visited Karachi as an outsider, and you go around Karachi, you see the Rangers everywhere, and they certainly look like the army. I know they're a paramilitary wing, but they certainly look like the regular army. And then you see the police, and they seem to be conducting traffic. And it very much, as an outsider, appears that the monopoly on state-sanctioned violence falls with the Rangers and not the police. But Karachi also had the reputation of being an extremely violent city, both due to violent party politics, and also it became home for Taliban commanders in its outer districts. And that violence has been reduced, but at the cost of a militarization of the city. It's a militarized city. Anyone who goes through Pakistan, through Karachi, will see checkpoints with heavily armed Rangers. Do you think this is a sustainable approach to dealing with counterterrorism in Pakistan's largest city? And how might the U.S. or what concerns might the United States have over this approach?
So two big questions. I'll take the first one, which is in terms of the militarization, and I'll just sort of talk about the fact that the state-sanctioned violence is not just being meted out by the Rangers; it's also being meted out by Sindh police, and I think that is essentially what led to the movement PTM coming about, as that was essentially it was born out of an extrajudicial killing of a Pashtun. A young Pashtun person, and the Sindh police or officers within the Sindh police were of course responsible for that extrajudicial killing. So that's how the movement came about. So the violence you see is being meted out by both institutions, I would say. And in terms of sort of the TTP, populating Karachi's violent or landscape of violence. Yes, predominantly since 2007, 2009, I would say. In 2007, we of course saw the attack on Benazir Bhutto's convoy on 18th October. We also have seen since 2009 TTP trying to sort of gain a greater legitimacy in certain pockets of Karachi, establishing mobile courts, etc. So I think yes, because of the Karachi operation over the last sort of 4 or 5 years, that hold has been broken, but we are seeing certain elements kind of coming back into Karachi. For example, like recently we also saw the TTP claiming responsibility for the killing of a police officer, a targeted killing of a police officer. So the police is cognizant, recognizes the fact that these elements are returning to Karachi, and I think that was also expected. Because you can't resolve, like Asfandyar says, there needs to be other solutions to this. You cannot resolve militancy in Karachi with through just firefighting and very militarized responses. There has to be a concerted policy making that addresses the root causes behind this violence, right? So and I just also like to say, when I talk about TTP sort of populating the landscape, of course we also have militant wings of political parties operating in Karachi, which is why the paramilitary was called in, and which is why the police was increasingly militarized. But even before that, so in the 80s, for example, we've had in urban areas, not just in Karachi, we've seen sectarian militants also operating. So the CTDs, for example, the counterterrorism departments, are born out of specialized sort of police units that are called CIDs, and CIDs were pretty much responsible for addressing sectarian violence in urban centers and rural areas as well. So they're sort of like these specialized units that are coming up to address counterterrorism are very much sort of being born out of existing units. They're not essentially separate units that are coming out. They're employing the same officers. They're based on the same foundations that are sort of created to suppress all forms of violence. In terms of sort of U.S. You were talking. I think the question was about U.S. cooperation and what the U.S. can do. I think in terms of dealing with the policing, there are two things that I see are happening. The two sort of trends we're seeing. One is the interest by some policy circles in the U.S., but also outside the U.S. in other countries and by international organizations, in how to reform policing to make it more community oriented and more community friendly and sort of provide this community policing model. But at the same time, we're also seeing investments happening in counterterrorism policing. And the two models, the community policing model and counterterrorism policing model, follow very different philosophies, and they demand very different kinds of police practices and police responses and allocation of resources. So it's very difficult to see sort of how the US or other agencies, trying to help Pakistan reform its policing, the civilian policing infrastructure, is going to reconcile these two very different frameworks. Because there is training that is offered to CTDs, counterterrorism departments, and then there is training offered to the regular routine police officers and regular police departments, but they are overlapping. And counterterrorism is not just the mandate of the CTDs. You have crime investigation units also doing counterterrorism, and you have regular police also responding to terrorism. So it's fairly mixed. It's not that easy to separate. So it's interesting to see how going forward the US and other players trying to improve policing in Pakistan are going to reconcile with two very different frameworks at work at play, if that makes sense.
Adam, could I respond to that?
Yeah, definitely.
So Zoha, I'm so glad that you mentioned that. And I would just add that imagine the situation in the United States today with policing, and everything you said applies to what's happening in the United States, except you can just change out the ethnic groups and the racial categories, right? But can you imagine somebody coming here from another country and trying to figure out how to fix our system? It seems, first of all, it's very arrogant and not realistic, but it's also complicated by all these administrative, variations. And, I live in DC, then there's the state, then there's the federal, and then you have these very complex, nuanced social contracts with the state institutions, right? And every group has their own relationship. So if I think of Karachi, administratively, it's a nightmare, right? And then you have the ethnic, political violence, and then the transnational terrorism angle that Adam was talking about. And then you want to throw the United States in there, one of the most unpopular foreign countries in Pakistan, and I think it's really interesting though that it has come up, and the United States has put money into it. I mean, we did. I believe it was during the Obama administration, we increased the funding for law enforcement and police. And a lot of it was related to anti-money laundering and narcotics. And so you'll see that there's there's an overlap in counterterrorism priorities, and then these other priorities which affect are part of the terrorism space, but they pre-existed Al-Qaeda, right? Anti-money laundering, illicit finance. Like, we also had these same structures in the United States too, and then they just became applied to terrorism and counterterrorism approaches. So in a way, this isn't new thinking. It's been there. And I personally, like, obviously, like, we're always looking for solutions. But I personally think it's like it's so complex that there's not one solution. But the thing that keeps coming back to me is that the more localized foreign policy can get, the better it can be for both sides, right? And that is going to take a long time to understand kind of the nuances of Karachi, for example, and the interplay between the Rangers and the police and the different groups at play. I always advocate for more engagement with the social actors and civil society, because they're the ones that are going to be provoked and suppressed by these kinds of tactics and the militarization of the police and paramilitary forces. So, the United States does not have a good track record of that anywhere, really. And there's always suspicion with, like, it being a cover for intelligence activities. So I'm not advocating that is what we do, but we just have to be listening to different voices, and we're not doing that enough.
You said a couple interesting things, Shamila, and I think I want to talk for a moment about the fact that the U.S. is not popular among Pakistanis, despite an incredible amount of U.S. aid and military aid that the U.S. has provided to Pakistan. And I think you actually wrote in an article that Pakistanis should have a natural cultural affinity for the United States, but that the war on terror really upended that. So maybe you could expand a little bit about what has been the cost of the U.S. war on terror and the way the U.S. led the war on terror in terms of the perception of everyday Pakistanis about America, and what is the cost of that, both from a diplomatic perspective and a security perspective, and how might the United States use a diplomacy-centered approach to Pakistan to change that?
So I should say that I'm speaking as, a member of the diaspora living in the United States, have been raised in the United States. And so my experiences and comments are mostly from my time working on policy and as a student of history. So with that, I would argue that, leading up to 9/11, the U.S. was not popular for other reasons. It was unpopular because of sanctions. And there were already, like, when 9/11 happened and we entered into our alliance with Musharraf, all of the State Department polling that was done at that time, and also just independent organization polling, showed that the majority of Pakistanis did not expect the United States to be trustworthy or a good partner. However, the majority of them believed that this was an important relationship, right? So that's sanctions era sentiment. And then that sustained itself through the post 9/11 cooperation. The U.S. became only less trustworthy, I would say. And I think the same on the other side. Like, Americans who were in the know just thought, well, you found bin Laden there. Like, how can we trust this country, right? So it didn't really change. What I think is important to recognize is that there's still high rates of acknowledgement that the United States and Pakistan have to have a relationship, that it's important for them to have a relationship. And that's where I think, like, it gets to your question of, like, what can we do with that, right? Does it always have to be that it's about nuclear cooperation and security? It may be for the White House and for the Prime Minister's house, but it doesn't have to be that way for everyone else. And that's really where there's a lot of work that we can do together. And, we're doing it through the American Pakistan Foundation, and Adam, like with yourself and others, that we're building a community of basically people who want to understand what's actually happening in Pakistan and how we can incubate ideas together. So I think, like, we should focus on all these other things that people ignore. And this event is about security, but, like, tech space, like, incubating ideas that can lead to innovative solutions to like poverty, climate change, illiteracy. There's so many things that can be done. And there's, we talk about this demographic shift that has happened in Pakistan over the past decade, and we're reaping the benefits of it now, right? Because people are so active on social media, young folks are starting their own, tech startups. And so there's a lot of cooperation to be had. I don't think we should continue to rely on the governments to facilitate that. It should happen in spite of it.
Those are great comments. And certainly Pakistani civil society has always been vibrant. And I think it's extremely vibrant at present. And of course, young people, because of social media and technology, are becoming more involved, and especially in tech startups and in the private sector. So there's certainly opportunities there. And I'd also argue that climate change is one of the biggest security challenges for South Asia. It is a security question, and the United States could be doing more in that realm. But I'd like to, since we were talking about the lack of popularity of the U.S. among Pakistanis, and part of that, one of the more controversial U.S. policies in Pakistan was drone strikes. But there was also this perception. That the Pakistani state welcomed drone strikes because they eliminated problematic people for the Pakistani state. So I'd like to ask Asfandyar this question: what do you think the future of drone strikes is in Pakistan? And even though, can you explain the disconnect between the Pakistani society, the Pakistani society's position towards drone strikes, and the government's position towards drone strikes? And when is a drone strike acceptable for the Pakistani government, and when isn't it? If you could add some nuance to that, I'd appreciate it.
Right. So the drone war went on for almost a decade, starting in 2004. It ramped up in 2008, and then it was waged at a very high tempo in President Obama's both first and second terms, and it finally sort of culminated, I think, in 2015. And then there was a separate spate of drone strikes in 2017 and 2018. But the campaign, which took place from 2004 to 2015, and I'm speaking about it, but I think Shamaila can say a lot more on the issue. She dealt with it. She sort of oversaw parts of it. The program had tacit consent of the Pakistani state. Pakistani state authorities, or specifically Pakistani intelligence, cooperated at least for a period of time. In my work, I have sort of uncovered the breadth of the secret pact, covert pact, which sort of undergirded the conduct of drone strikes. Pakistan assured the U.S. a benign airspace. Intelligence was shared. Targets were sort of mutually determined and decided. And at one point, there were even U.S. personnel inside Pakistani tribal areas, in the offices of Pakistani intelligence service, ISI. So there was a lot of cooperation, but at the same time, this was a very dysfunctional vertical of the relationship, and parts of the Pakistani state protested. They were uncomfortable with the backlash that came with each drone strike. There was extensive debate on civilian casualties, which certainly took place, but they were also sort of overblown by some state-sponsored media. So it ended up, on balance, harming the bilateral relationship as opposed to strengthening it. While at the same time, these drone strikes took care of a major problem faced by the Pakistani state. So TTP's degradation, which we see in the period from 2011 to 2016, would not have taken place without the drone strikes. Much of TTP's top leadership was removed from the battlefield by U.S. drone strikes, and the benefits of that were reaped by the Pakistani public, which was often caught in the middle of highly violent attacks against civilians. So in that sense, I think drone strikes are a complicated part of the U.S. Pakistan bilateral relationship, and for that reason, reviving them with the consent of the Pakistani state will be extremely difficult. I think convincing Pakistani military and intelligence leadership to let drone strikes take place, I think would never say no, but I think it would be a tall order. And for now, honestly, I don't see U.S. policymakers sort of heading in that direction. I think, on the other hand, what I suspect they are asking of Pakistanis is to provide some kind of basing for a residual counterterrorism force for Afghanistan, right? So as U.S. draws down from Afghanistan, folds its bases, Bagram, and some of the bases that say you were in southern Afghanistan, there will be a concern about a continued threat of transnational jihadis operating from Afghanistan. And if US forces are insecure, cannot stay inside Afghanistan, they need bases to operate drones, surveillance platforms, have some kind of a forward platform which can conduct intelligence collection and assess the threats that exist on the ground. And for that, I think there will be a conversation with Pakistan, in addition to some other countries like Central Asia, in Central Asia. So I suspect that that Pakistan might be willing to play ball with the U.S. on that front.
So I imagine that would require some very bold diplomacy on the part of the United States. Your comments actually lead us into a great question from the audience, which is, down the road, if peace talks were to fail and the Afghan Taliban were to seize power in Afghanistan, what impact might this have on militant networks in Pakistan and stability more broadly in the country? And I'll direct that question to Shamila.
So I think if I'm just trying to find the question here. I want to see the words that.
Yeah, it's actually not in the Q&A tab, unfortunately.
Okay, so if we're saying that the peace talks fail and then power is seized, then obviously that's going to be bad for everybody in Afghanistan and Pakistan, because it emboldens kind of anyone that's looking at the Afghan Taliban as kind of a role model or as an example to follow, right? So TTP, any of the groups in Punjab, Karachi, they're going to be highly motivated by such moves. I think that I don't think that that's likely. I don't even really contemplate that, to be honest, because I think we're not well beyond it. Like, nothing is impossible, but I do think that the Taliban are of the mind that they need to be much more integrated into this international space and conversation to be legitimate. And why should they seize power when they can just, they can have meetings in the Gulf and get, media engagements and that sort of thing. Like, that's a much smarter path for their legitimacy. I actually think the question we should be asking is, like, what roles will traditional Taliban leaders get in a new government there, and how does that shape security and insecurity in Pakistan? That's it's a realistic question, but it's also potentially more impactful. For example, whatever ministries that the Taliban get assigned, if there's some kind of peace deal, right? What are they responsible for? Obviously, they have this interest on the border in these provinces and those are, sources of big sources of, like, illicit drugs and trade, and of which groups in Pakistan and various institutions also have a lot of interest in. So there's a huge destabilizing effect beyond just, like, US security interest. You could see an uptick in drug use, for example, drug trade, violence because of that, at the result of that. So I think the Pakistani government is, like, keenly aware of that, like that, and let's not forget that lots and lots of people have died in Pakistan as the result of, the conflict with the Taliban and the trickle down effects in Pakistan. So I don't think anyone is looking at it as they're on our side and they're not on our side. There's no more like black and white here. It's really like, how can we kind of negotiate with all the different stakeholders to get kind of to this, not common ground, but just like, to figure out like how we get out of this stalemate, essentially. That's where I think we're at.
I mean, you raise a very good point that Pakistan has paid an enormous price in terms of lives in the war on terror, which I think is sometimes lost in the U.S. conversation. But I'd like to follow up on that with if the intra-Afghan talks succeed and a political settlement is achieved in Afghanistan and U.S. troops fully withdraw from the country, what will Pakistan want in return for its help in achieving those talks, if anything? And what kind of relationship and diplomacy will be necessary to have a productive relationship with Pakistan to achieve what Asfandyar mentioned, which is being able to have counterterrorism capabilities in the region without keeping troops inside Afghanistan? How can that be achieved, Shamila?
That's a great question. And I think Asfandyar mentioned a lot of the things that would be a component of that relationship, right? Like the reason we're in this situation is that the US doesn't really have a basing, there's no base in South Asia, right? So when you have a base, you're able to monitor long-term developments, you're able to share intelligence, collect information, you're able to do certain trainings together. And we just don't have that. And I think that's a space where the Pakistani and American militaries could potentially collaborate if they're being long-term and strategic and thoughtful about it, not tactical. But that would require on the US side a lot more money being pumped into it. And again, remember these two countries have worked together for a long time and have kind of asked each other for a lot monetarily. And so there's going to be the same kind of tactical approach, like give us this much money for our military and then we'll let you do this. And I just that's going to be really hard under the current circumstances, like publicly, like, like Asfandyar said, like, you're never going to be able to sell a drone war again. You were able to sell it. Right. So any contract with the United States is going to be illicit in that sense, because it's really just focused on like the military's interests, security, and it has never been counterinsurgency focused. It's just counterterrorism focused. But if I'm thinking in my head as a U.S. policymaker and what we would do, just say in the next 1 to 3 years, I would definitely say that we would need to rebuild the institutional relationship between the militaries and then other related institutions, because right now, as I was saying earlier, it's very top level, and that's been enough for everybody involved, but it's not going to be enough to sustain a post peace process, reconciled Afghanistan. It's just not, right? And that's what I think will happen. And this is where, if history is any guide, that's where we will rely even more on our intelligence services in both countries, because they've continued to kind of cooperate at their levels, right? And they're able to facilitate and make things happen easier, more efficiently, quicker, with more money, frankly. And again, not a good space for us to be in, but I could envision something like that happening.
I think it's a key distinction you make between tactical cooperation and having a long-term strategy. And too often, US policy in South Asia has focused exclusively on the tactical. And it's also an interesting point that you raise about having institutional cooperation beyond the security partnership. And I want to go back to Zoha, actually, because besides just having relationships between institutions, one of the Q&A questions actually talks about how the United States often goes through gatekeepers in terms of understanding Pakistan. And I've also heard gatekeepers both in the United States and in Pakistan. And I've heard that criticism from Pakistanis inside Pakistan, that the US goes through a few NGOs inside Pakistan, and that's how they relate to the broader society. And they don't get an accurate, US policymakers don't get an accurate perception of the ground realities in Pakistan, from a civil rights perspective, from a security perspective, from a cultural perspective, and from a political perspective. And given your granular knowledge of the ground realities inside Pakistan and more specifically Karachi, do you think there's any validity to that criticism? And how might US policymakers and diplomats better understand what's going on in Pakistan?
So I just wanted to sort of touch back on the idea of U.S. installing sort of bases in Pakistan and continuing a military partnership with Pakistan. I think that again focuses on a very sort of as you said, it's a very security centric approach. And I want to go back to my previous point that I was talking about, that if counterterrorism is counterterrorism cooperation between the two countries is just going to be about military speaking to each other, then I think that's a very limited way of addressing. Like Shamila said, there's no counterinsurgency happening, then there's no counter extremism happening, then, right? So it's a very short sort of it's very short-sighted if the cooperation is just going to be completely between the two militaries, and then you are looking at a furthering like the militarization of civilian policing just continuing, and then you're not going to see the Rangers pulling out. And you're not going to see other paramilitaries pulling out, because they are going to bank on the fact that the militaries need to have this sort of a militarized policing happening in certain, and that will continues to sort of delegitimize the civilian law enforcement agencies, and that will continue to sort of limit the reach of civilian agencies and civilian institutions in Pakistan. So I think that's something that we really need to kind of be careful about, and having bases in Pakistan kind of throws me off a little bit. So I don't know how serious that that sort of suggestion is, or how realistic that sort of is, but anything is possible. But anyways, coming back to sort of your question, I think there has been some suspicion about the activities that NGOs and sort of donor-funded agencies have been doing in Pakistan, and therefore we did see like a pretty wide-scale clampdown a couple of years back on NGOs within Pakistan. But I think it's just I think that's true in a lot of countries where you have sort of donor agencies working, and you have NGOs and workers go from the US or the UK, and they come into Pakistan or in other countries to kind of carry out certain work, certain information does get exchanged. So I think on a local level, there is suspicion of that, no doubt. But to what extent that's true for all agencies, because I mean, there are certain organizations that are doing really good work. So I wouldn't want there to be the way the PTI did it. They pretty much, took out a list, I think, of several dozen NGOs operating in Pakistan that had to sort of cease their operations. So I think, if that's not happening with any evidence, then it's very problematic, especially for, a third world country that does need certain NGOs to be operating. So a blanket ban, I don't think is going to do any good. But yes, I would imagine there is significant suspicion over the activities of some of these organizations.
Adam, I want to
Sure, jump in.
Clarify on the basing. Like, I don't think it's a good idea. I would have advocated myself. Also, there's, if you notice, in a lot of Muslim countries, Americans have a base, but it's not even called a base because politically you just can't sell it. So there's this like legacy of American presence in Muslim countries that also works against the United States. I think what the U.S. needs to do is sit down and figure out like what do I actually care about in Pakistan, and how am I going to achieve that? And what kind of resources do I need on the ground, both intellectual, whether it's military or foreign service or development, that all needs to be thought through along the lines of a much more nuanced long-term strategy. And in the absence of that, we're going to be status quo for a long time. And so in lieu of using the word base, like, let's just think more of it as what kind of resources are required to continue to know Pakistan and to work with its institutions and people. And we just don't have that. And other countries that where the US does have a base, where it's and it's much more palatable, right? it's a lot easier to send people, for example, to just go and learn. And like bureaucrats, for example, you can be like, oh, just go for a 1-year detail, in Bahrain, and you can learn and absorb and understand the region. We don't really have that relationship with South Asia because we don't have a permanent place. And I just don't think we should, because it's not right. But it has, like, that basing strategy, which has a lot of criticism, has actually facilitated a lot of good exposure as well as bad outcomes too. So we have to rethink kind of these, how we ground ourselves as Americans overseas. I don't think that strategy is effective. We need to think of a new way.
So then let me just follow up with you, Shamila. Does Pakistan offer an opportunity for the United States to explore a new strategy that's restraint oriented, not based on having military bases in a country, not necessarily even counterterrorism focused, but that uses, I suppose we could call it aggressive diplomacy and people-to-people ties to better understand the country and in turn, be able to better work together against common threats? And is there an opportunity, and how might that be achieved?
To be honest, I don't think there's an opportunity right now, kind of on the government to government side. I think that what we've seen from like Bush at 9/11 to Bush at the end of his tenure, and Obama and now Trump, is a fairly consistent, like, organic evolution of a relationship that has become, it has gone up in cooperation, and now it's just kind of flatlined. And it's not, at this point, it's just because both sides have agreed to accept, like, this is where we're at. And realistically, they've devoted the amount of diplomatic resources that equals the kind of level of interest. To be honest, like, I don't know that the budget or the increased resources could actually defend the interest right now, right? Because it would be hard to do things on the ground. I'm always an advocate of more diplomacy, but that means we have to empower the State Department. It's a truncated State Department right now. We don't have resources, and there's so many positions unfilled. And so if there is a transition in the US government, we're going to observe the United States doing less with less, basically, right? So it's not even doing more with less. We're going to maintain this level of interest, I think, because we have to kind of wrap up this war. And we need Pakistan to a certain extent. But if, realistically speaking, you wouldn't make any big new moves if you're trying to wrap up a war. Like, that doesn't make any sense. And I don't think anyone is anticipating that. So over time, however, I think the thing that has really worked with the US and Pakistan has been this, exchange of intellectual exchanges, students going back and forth. We have several good examples here, of, transnational exchanges and building dialogue and partnerships that way. And if you just send high school students from Pakistan to the United States to, like, live here for half a semester for 20 years, I think you're good. Right. And that requires a lot of money over time, or a little bit of money over time, but it requires sustained attention. And one final point, the sustained attention is facilitated by Congress as well on our end. So if there are actors in Congress, staffers, and elected officials who care about the relationship in that way, in a more nuanced way, and if their constituents, who should be Pakistani Americans and other people who care about it, if they say you should care about these things, they will, because their livelihood and their job depends on it. So there's a whole ecosystem and a cycle that enables the people to people that you talk about. And I think a lot of it, like I said, is doable in spite of what the governments are doing, but there's a limit there's a ceiling we hit, because our two governments only really want to work at the security level in, like, an intense way.
Right. So if I can quickly sort of interject on the direction the relationship is headed in. Unfortunately, using a word that Shamila used, realistically, I think the relationship is not headed in a good trajectory. It may not go in a bad trajectory, but and it may sort of hold current trajectory, but it's not a healthy one. It's not a super functional one, and there are two reasons for that. One is what we talk a lot about in DC and the US, which I think Pakistanis don't fully understand, is the return of great power competition. the US's sort of rivalry with China. Irrespective of who becomes the next president, I think we are going to see intensified security competition. And Pakistan's alignment with China, current level of alignment with China, will naturally bring stress on the U.S.-Pakistan relationship. So that's one. The second factor which will weigh on the security counterterrorism partnership is, I think, is Afghan Taliban's relationship with foreign transnational jihadists like Al-Qaeda. The United States government is, of course, going to bilaterally deal with the Taliban. There is a relationship. I don't see it sort of going away. I think that's one lesson of the pre-9/11 era that everyone seems to have internalized. But in addition, the U.S. is looking to for levers to lean on the Taliban, and of course, there is a widespread understanding that Pakistan has the ability to coerce, to pressure, or to sort of shape Taliban's behavior. And as a result of that, this is going to be an added new dimension to an already complex, complicated counterterrorism portfolio, between the two countries. And yeah, I think the Afghan Taliban's sort of current stand on foreign terrorist organizations is not a promising one. It appears problematic, and unfortunately, I expect it will continue to be a problem going forward.
Well, I want to thank all the panelists and the attendees to this talk. I wish we had more time. I think we could probably go on for hours about this. And we tried to cover a lot of ground. I agree it's a complex relationship, but I also share some of Shamaila's hope that through private sector development, through people-to-people ties and diplomacy, I think we can, over time, overcome some of these challenges if, so long as we're willing to accept that they don't have a military solution. It's more complex than that, which I think has come through with all of your points. So I just want to thank all of you for attending, and the audience for listening. And I hope we can speak again sometime soon.
Thank you,